Hello everyone, I am a federated chess player of standard federating of around 1550. I am playing competitive chess since the year 2020 and that's why I exactly know how a beginner or an intermediate level player can improve themselves from such situations which are difficult, complicated. How can they improve their calculation over the board? In this channel, we are going to discuss about things more practically than just seeing the theory, which are very complex to understand. We are going to check out many things like piece placement and piece play, how each piece can be used properly on the board, how to create harmony between your pawns and pieces, and coordinate your pieces in the game. So, let's get started. Hello everyone. So today we are going to discuss about pawn structures and why it is better to first understand how the pawn structures work and how they polish and make your gameplay rather than just memorizing any complex opening lines from any internet or social media or from any YouTuber. So let's get started. So the first pawn structure which we are going to see is this. Very basic structure I have taken. So this pawn structure, what it shows you about the position, how can you make sure what the pawn structure are saying to you, how they're shaping the game in the starting and beginning of your chess game, how they shape it, how they like help you make plans, how they help you put the pieces in the right places, etc. Let's discuss. So, seeing the pawn structure, the first thing which you can say about it is that white has all his pawns on the mostly on the dark colored squares. As you can see on h2 to g3, f4, and here from d4 to c3 to b2, and only one pawn is on a2, which is not on dark colored square. So what it says about white is that any bishop, if white has, which is of dark colored square, should be outside the pawn chain, which is somewhere here, here, or here, anywhere in this range. So, which what it will do is that it will not trap the bishop inside the pawn structure and make it passive. Uh, Imagine the bishop somewhere here. Let's take the bishop is somewhere here. See what is the bishop doing? It's just looking at the blank pawns of its own structure. Doing cannot able to do anything from here. Just looking at blank pawn structures and nothing it was possible to do just sitting inside the pawn structure. While a bishop which is here will be more happy as it can see a long range towards black's structure, towards black's territory, and also it can do some damage if necessary at this pawn structures which black has it. So this is how you understand that your dark square bishop should be outside the pawn structure, or it should be exchanged off for a knight or any other piece that black has. For example, white can try to exchange its own dark square bishop for black's dark square bishop. Why? Because in this situation, if you can see black's pawn structure, most of the pawns are on the light squares, which means if there is any dark square bishop, it will be very much complementary to this structure of blacks because black will have like a dark square weaknesses if there is no dark square bishops or bishop with black because light squares of black is already taken care by your pawn. So who will control the dark squares? Of course, the bishops or the queens. So if you can easily like trade your dark square bishop, which is a bad bishop for this pawn structure of white, with black's dark square bishop, then you will be in a completely winning situation because your opponent will not have a complementary dark square bishop to take care of their dark squares. And this will prove really helpful as you can exploit their dark squares using your queen, your knights, and there will be no way that black can defend any kind of threats on the dark square as there is no pawn which is controlling the dark square. As you can see, the dark squares are vulnerable without the dark square bishop. So that's why a dark square bishop will be like swap for black will be very much like you can say positionally losing for the black or positionally disadvantageous for black. Similarly, a light square bishop for you, let's take a light square bishop here, is way better for white and can see a long range as the dark squares are covered and protected by the pawns, and the light squares will cover the light squares of uh, like light square bishop will cover all the light squares vulnerabilities that white can have. And of course, you should make sure if your pawns are on dark squares and you have a light square bishop, not to exchange it even if your opponent offers you to exchange the dark square bishop. Try to preserve it because if you exchange the dark square bishop, your light squares will become vulnerable and can be exploited by your opponent as there is no pawns on the light squares at all. And if you try to push these pawns, then in the future, even your king can get vulnerable. So with the pawns, it can be hanging. Pawns can go down as pushing more pawns means making it even weaker and weaker. So this is about bishops. Let's come about rooks. As you can see, there is one open file in this whole position. So of course, you must keep your rooks in the open file. It's basic. You can double up your rooks in the open file. Black will also try to double up the rooks in the open file, and and that's how you have to place your pieces. It's all about keeping peace harmony, keeping peace coordination. That light square bishop will take control of the light squares. Dark square bishop outside the pawn chain will attack the position of black. Similarly, black can have a dark square bishop somewhere, like a dark square bishop somewhere here, trying to attack this pawn structure and break it open sometime somewhere in the future by pushing these pawns. And also black should have a light square bishop of its own outside this pawn structure so that it can also see a long range towards white's territory. So this is how one should play and how one should play and place the pieces in this pawn structure. Coming to the knights, knights will be a bit tricky as you can see there is only few outposts that knights can take for white. For white situation, knight can stay in this because it's an outpost. Outpost is such a area where a knight can stay and is well protected by its pawns and cannot be driven away by your opponent's pawns or pieces, which means a very stable knight in the center of the board. Also, there is other outpost which knight can take, like this outpost as dark square of black is weak. After swapping your bishops, you can make sure that you push this pawn till here and then place a knight here, which will make things more difficult for black. Similarly, black can also place their knights over here. Of course, they have to maneuver their knight over there, and also you also should maneuver your knights to this place so that there will be some kind of blockade. Your like your opponent cannot have rooks pointing here into your territory. Also, your opponent will try to place a knight here so that your rooks cannot get into their territory. So this is how the battle of chess happens. So see how easily you are able to make up where your pawns, like where your pieces should stay in the structure and how they should stay in the structure in order to like get it harmony with your pawn structure, as we can see here. Also, if your bishop is here eyeing at your opponent's pawn structure, how can you make sure this pawn structure opens up so that your bishop will become more active? Is by pushing these pawns, breaking the structure, and eventually making this bishop more and more dangerous. As the moment the structure breaks, this pawn structure becomes vulnerable, and anytime you can attack this pawn structure with your pieces or even the king if it goes to the end game and gobble it up during that situation. So this is how you should shape your or like ideas during the middle game ideas and place your pieces in the right squares during the opening, and this is how the pawn structure determines where your pieces should be and how you should play the middle game during a chess match. So let's go to another pawn structure which we know. So this is the other pawn structure. So if you can see clearly, the pawn structure here is a bit different. Here we can see that there is isolated pawns on both sides. You can see this is doubled and isolated pawn of black side, and this is doubled and isolated pawns of white side. So how can a play go on in such a pawn structure? Of course, white has to play here by placing a knight here, trying to attack these double pawn structures here. Bring your queens and bishops over this direction, trying to attack these pawn structures immediately with your queens and bishops, trying to infiltrate in this way. While what should black do? Of course, black can bring and place a knight here as it's an outpost, and of course, black can bring all the pieces over here, the queen here, the bishops here, and attack this pawn structures and of whites, which is vulnerable. So this is how you make sure what is more like important, how you can decide where your pieces should go during any middle game or end game situations. So also, these pawn structures show that your king should not be within this area, because if your king is in this area, then easily black can come in, attack your king, and you might be in grave danger, as this pawn structure doesn't support anything. This, as it is an isolated pawn structure. Knight can come here attacking your king. Queen can join your knight. Bishop can come easily, and this will be very much troublesome. Similarly, for black, black should not keep their king here, which will be more vulnerable, as knight on f5, queen on h4, and bishop on h6. This can be really dangerous for black in the upcoming game, as the king is here, if you can see. So this is how you decide. Also, we can learn about a concept of pawn islands. Pawn island is basically how many split structure your pawns have in the position. So in this situation, both black and white have three pawn islands. Why and how? Because if you can see h2, g3, f2, and e4, they're one pawn island. As the pawns are connected, they are beside each other. So that's and they're creating one huge structure. Similarly, for black, a6, b7, and c6 is one of the pawn islands, big pawn island, as they're connected to each other. They're not separated from each other. And whenever there is a separation, there is another pawn island. So you can see there is a separation on the d file, and then there is a pawn island on c2 and c3 pawns. And as the pawns are not beside each other, they are called as isolated pawns. And as they're together, that's why they are another pawn island. They are not connected by any other pawns beside them. So that's why it's another pawn island. And finally, white has this tiny pawn at the edge of the board. This is a lone pawn, and this is another pawn island, as there is no other pawn supporting it being beside it, and that's why it's the third pawn island. There is a gap here at b file, and there is no pawns connecting it. So that's why it's a third pawn island. If there was a pawn on b2, then this whole structure, if you can see this whole structure of c3, c2, b2, and a2 would have been one pawn island. So because there is no pawn here, so there are two separate pawn islands. Similarly for black here, the f6, f7, and e5 pawn create another pawn island where f6 and f7 are the doubled and isolated pawns. Basically not isolated exactly, but they are definitely doubled, and they're weak. And there is another tiny pawn of black, which is on h7. It's definitely an isolated pawn and is very easy to attack. It's vulnerable. So what we learn is another pawn island for black. So what we learn from this is that we must keep our pawns undoubled and try to keep as less pawn islands as possible, which is better for us. Not let your opponent double your pawns, which is bad. It can create a lot of weaknesses in your position. And if we go to the previous position in this situation, can you count how many pawn islands are there for both black and white? I'll give you some time. You can pause. Yes, you are right. Both black and white have two pawn islands, where this pawn island of white, A2, B2, C3, and D4 is one pawn island. There is a separation on the E file, and then F4, G3, and H2 is another pawn island as they're connected. Similarly, for black, H7, G7, and F5 is one pawn island as they are together. And then there is a separation on the E file. And then D5, C6, B7, and A6 is another pawn island. So this is a better structure for both black and white, while this other pawn structure is slightly damaged pawn structure for both the sides, which can take advantage of. So this is how the pawn structure works in favor or against you, depending on how you place your pieces, where you play exactly during such games. So thank you. This was the pawn structure video and how it helps you know what you should do during a game, how it creates your game and opening plans, how it helps you in the long run to place your pieces in the right places and lets you win games easily by knowing where your pieces must go. So that's it. This is Rajdeep signing off. Bye bye.